The medical scanner beeped softly as Dr. Emma Ward checked the vitals of her latest patient. The young soldier's blue blood indicated he was Catherian, one of the enemy forces that had been fighting humans for 3 years now. His breathing was shallow, and the plasma burns across his chest would take weeks to heal properly. Emma adjusted the treatment settings without hesitation. On the hospital ship Hope's Light, there were no enemies or allies. There were only patients who needed help. The Red Cross painted on the ship's white hull meant something important to her. It meant that everyone deserved medical care, no matter which side they fought for. The massive vessel drifted through the neutral zone between human and Catherian space. Its engines hummed quietly as it maintained a steady course toward the nearest human medical facility. 3,000 wounded beings filled the ship's medical bays. Some were human soldiers with missing limbs and radiation sickness. Others were from allied species that fought alongside humanity. Many were Catherian prisoners of war who had been injured during recent battles. Emma moved between the medical bays with practiced efficiency. She had been a military doctor for 15 years, but nothing had prepared her for the scale of casualties from this war. The Catherian Empire controlled half the galaxy and possessed technology that made their weapons devastatingly effective. Their ships were faster, their shields stronger, and their soldiers seemed to feel no fear in battle. Yet here in the medical bays, they looked just as fragile as any other wounded creature. The young Catherian soldier she had been treating opened his large dark eyes and stared at her with confusion. "Why are you helping me?" he asked in broken human language. Emma smiled gently as she checked his bandages. "Because you need help. That's what doctors do." The soldier's expression showed genuine puzzlement. In Catherian culture, showing mercy to enemies was considered weakness. Their military doctrine emphasized total victory and complete destruction of opposing forces. The concept of neutral medical aid was foreign to them. The ship's communication system crackled to life. "All medical staff, this is the bridge. We're receiving multiple scanner readings of Catherian ships approaching our position. They're being informed of our medical status and neutral designation." Emma felt a small chill of worry. The Hope's Light broadcast its medical identification on all frequencies and followed every international law regarding hospital ships. The vessel carried no weapons and posed no military threat. Under the Geneva Conventions of Space, which even the Catherian Empire had signed, medical ships were completely off-limits to military action. She continued her rounds, checking on patients and coordinating with other medical staff. The ship carried doctors, nurses, and medical technicians from 6 different species. All of them had volunteered for this dangerous assignment because they believed in the sacred nature of medical neutrality. Dr. Tom Rivers, the ship's chief medical officer, approached Emma with a concerned expression. "The Catherian ships aren't responding to our identification signals. They're maintaining attack formation." Emma frowned. "That doesn't make sense. Even they wouldn't violate medical neutrality. The political backlash would be enormous." "Maybe they think we're carrying something other than patients," Tom suggested. "Then, they can request to inspect us. That's also covered under the conventions." The 2 doctors made their way to the main medical bay where the most critically wounded patients were being treated. Human and Catherian medical equipment worked side by side, keeping beings from multiple species alive. The sight always reminded Emma why she had become a doctor in the first place. A new voice came over the communication system, speaking in heavily accented human language. "Medical vessel, this is Admiral Roth of the Catherian Imperial Fleet. You are ordered to surrender immediately for inspection." Emma and Tom exchanged glances. Standard procedure would be to allow a small inspection team aboard to verify the ship's medical status. There was nothing unusual about such a request. "This is Dr. Rivers, Chief Medical Officer of the Hope's Light. We accept your inspection request. Please send a small team to dock with our main airlock. We'll provide full access to all medical facilities." Several minutes passed in silence. The medical staff continued their work, though tension filled the air. Many of the wounded patients seemed to sense something was wrong. Even those in medical comas appeared restless. Emma was treating a human soldier with severe neural damage when the communication system activated again. This time, Admiral Roth's voice carried a different tone. Dr. Rivers, our analysis indicates. Your vessel contains weapons research and military intelligence. You have 5 minutes to evacuate all personnel. The medical bay fell silent. Emma felt her blood turn cold. That's impossible. We're a hospital ship. We don't carry any weapons or military equipment. Tom activated the ship's communication system. Admiral Roth, we strongly protest this accusation. We invite you to conduct a full inspection to verify our medical status. We have 3,000 wounded beings aboard who cannot be moved. You have 4 minutes remaining. Emma stared at the communication panel in disbelief. The Catherian admiral was ordering them to abandon wounded patients, even if they had enough escape pods, which they didn't. Moving critically injured patients would kill many of them immediately. He can't be serious, Tom whispered. The medical staff began moving frantically through the ship. Some tried to stabilize the most critical patients for potential evacuation. Others attempted to contact human military forces for assistance. Everyone knew there wasn't enough time to save even a fraction of the wounded. Emma found herself back at the bedside of the young Catherian soldier she had been treating. His eyes were wide with terror as he listened to his own admiral condemn him to death along with everyone else aboard the ship. Doctor, he said urgently, Admiral Roth is known for extreme methods. He believes showing mercy makes the Empire look weak. He will not change his mind. Emma gripped the soldier's hand. We're not abandoning you, none of you. Through the ship's observation windows, she could see the Catherian fleet arranging itself in attack formation. Dozens of warships pointed their weapons at the defenseless medical vessel. Emma realized with growing horror that Admiral Roth intended to murder 3,000 wounded beings to make a political statement about Catherian strength. The final minute countdown echoed through the ship. Medical staff held the hands of patients who were too injured to understand what was happening. Emma closed her eyes and thought about all the lives she had saved during her career. The Catherian weapons fired simultaneously, and the Hope's light disappeared in a brilliant explosion that could be seen from 3 star systems away. Deep in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, a hidden research station received signals from across the galaxy. Dr. Alex Chen sat in his laboratory, surrounded by screens displaying data streams from 100 different sources. He had built this place himself over 5 years, creating the most advanced intelligence-gathering network in human space. Alex was not like other scientists. He had studied the minds of alien species for 20 years, learning how they thought, what they feared, and what held their societies together. Before his self-imposed exile to this remote station, he had been humanity's most valuable intelligence analyst. His reports had helped human forces survive the early years of the Catherian War. The reason for his exile was simple. Alex had grown. Tired of politicians who ignored his warnings and military leaders who preferred direct attacks over careful strategy. He had predicted that the Catherians would eventually commit major war crimes, but nobody had listened. So he had disappeared into the asteroid belt to continue his work alone. His monitoring equipment detected the transmission from the Hope's light just as Admiral Roth began his final countdown. Alex watched in real time as the hospital ship tried, desperately to convince the Catherian admiral to allow inspection instead of destruction. He saw the medical staff working frantically to save their patients. He witnessed 3,000 innocent beings die in a flash of weapons fire. Alex stared at the empty space where the Hope's light had been. Among the dead was Dr. Emma Ward, who had saved his life during the Battle of Centauri Prime 2 years earlier. She had worked for 18 hours straight to repair the damage from a Catherian neural weapon that had nearly killed him. Now she was gone, murdered for the crime of helping wounded enemies. Most humans would have felt rage at such an atrocity. Alex felt something colder and more dangerous. He felt the calm focus that had made him the galaxy's leading expert on alien psychology. The Catherians had just made a critical mistake, and Alex intended to make them pay for it in ways they could never imagine. He began pulling up files on Catherian society that he had collected over the past decade. Their empire covered 200 star systems and included dozens of different species. Yet the Catherians themselves made up only 30% of the empire's population. They maintained control through a rigid caste system that convinced everyone of Catherian racial superiority. The system was brilliant in its simplicity. Catherians occupied all leadership positions in government, military, and business. Below them were the allied races, who had joined the empire voluntarily and held middle-level positions. At the bottom were the subject races, who had been conquered and served as workers and soldiers. What made the system stable was that everyone believed it was based on natural law. Catherians were stronger, smarter, and more advanced than other species. The allied races accepted their secondary status because they received protection and prosperity. The subject races endured their oppression because they had been taught that resistance was impossible. Alex had spent years studying the historical documents that supported these beliefs. He had analyzed Catherian genetic data, archaeological records, and cultural traditions. What he had discovered was fascinating. The entire foundation of Catherian superiority was built on lies, half-truths, and carefully edited history. The Catherians had not evolved into the dominant species through natural superiority. They had achieved their position through a series of historical accidents, lucky discoveries, and the genocide of several more advanced civilizations. Their technology had been stolen from conquered peoples. Their military tactics had been copied from enemies they had defeated through treachery rather than skill. Most interesting of all, Alex had found genetic evidence that the Catherians were closely related to the Orvani, a peaceful species known throughout the galaxy for their pacifism and gentle nature. The Orvani were everything the Catherians claimed to despise: weak, emotional, and incapable of violence. Yet the genetic markers were unmistakable. Alex realized that he was looking at the perfect weapon. Not a bomb or a virus, but something far more destructive: the truth. If he could convince Catherian society that their racial superiority was a myth, their entire empire would collapse from within. The plan that formed in his mind was complex and would require perfect execution. He would need to create false historical documents that appeared genuine. He would need to manipulate genetic data in ways that seemed scientifically valid. Most importantly, he would need to understand Catherian psychology well enough to predict exactly how they would react to each revelation. Alex began working with an intensity he had never experienced before. He studied every aspect of Catherian language, culture, and belief system. He analyzed their historical archives, looking for contradictions and inconsistencies that could be exploited. He created detailed psychological profiles of key Catherian leaders, predicting how they would respond to different types of information. The work took 3 weeks of continuous effort. Alex barely ate or slept as he crafted the most sophisticated disinformation campaign in galactic history. Unlike crude propaganda, his approach would use the Catherians' own scientific methods and cultural values against them. He created a series of ancient historical documents that revealed the true origins of Catherian civilization. The documents were written in archaic Catherian script and contained references that only genuine historical records would include. They told the story of how early Catherian leaders had systematically destroyed evidence of their humble origins and created myths of racial superiority to control their people. Alongside the historical documents, Alex prepared genetic analysis data that proved the Catherian connection to the Orvani. The data was technically accurate but presented in ways that emphasized the most embarrassing aspects of the relationship. He made it appear that Catherians were not just related to the Orvani, but were actually a violent offshoot that had abandoned their peaceful heritage. The final component was a psychological analysis of how this information would spread through Catherian society. Alex had identified the specific individuals, organizations, and communication networks that would be most effective at distributing his revelations. He knew exactly which scientists would find the genetic data compelling, which historians would be intrigued by the documents, and which political leaders would try to use the information for their own advantage. As Alex prepared to launch his campaign, he thought about the 3,000 beings who had died aboard the Hope's Light. Admiral Roth had killed them to demonstrate Catherian strength and superiority. Alex would use that same sense of superiority to destroy everything Roth fought to protect. The first seeds of doubt appeared in the University of Historical Studies on the Catherian homeworld. Professor Thane, a respected historian specializing in ancient civilization, discovered what appeared to be a cache of forgotten documents in the university's oldest archives. The documents were written in classical Catherian script and bore the authentication marks of the ancient royal library. What Professor Thane read in those documents challenged everything he thought he knew about his people's history. According to these records, the early Catherian civilization had been founded not by superior warriors conquering primitive species, but by refugees fleeing their original homeworld after a devastating plague. The refugees had been taken in by the gentle Orvani people who had provided them with technology, shelter, and knowledge. The documents described how later Catherian leaders had repaid this kindness by gradually enslaving their benefactors. They had stolen Orvani technology, copied their scientific advances, and eventually driven them from their shared worlds. To cover up this shameful history, Catherian rulers had destroyed most records of Orvani civilization and created new myths about their own racial superiority. Professor Thane spent weeks verifying the document's authenticity. The paper was genuine ancient material. The ink matched samples from other historical records, and the writing style was consistent with other texts from that period. Every test confirmed that these were real historical documents that had somehow been overlooked for centuries. Meanwhile, on the other side of Catherian space, Dr. Vera Koss made an equally disturbing discovery. As the Empire's leading geneticist, she had been conducting routine analysis of Catherian DNA samples for a medical research project. Her equipment detected unusual genetic markers that didn't match existing records of Catherian evolutionary history. The markers indicated that Catherians shared a common ancestor with the Orvani people within the last 50,000 years. This was impossible according to official Catherian history, which claimed their species had evolved independently for millions of years on their original homeworld. Dr. Koss ran the tests multiple times using different equipment and fresh samples. The results were always the same. Catherians and Orvanis were so genetically similar that they could be considered subspecies of the same original species. In fact, the evidence suggested that Catherians were actually the more recent branch, having diverged from the main Orvani population relatively recently in evolutionary terms. Both Professor Thane and Dr. Koss initially kept their discoveries private, unsure of how to handle information that contradicted fundamental beliefs about Catherian society. However, word began to spread through academic circles. Other historians requested access to the documents. Geneticists asked to verify Dr. Koss's findings. Alex had predicted this exact sequence of events. He had planted the historical documents, where Professor Thane would find them because the historian was known for his integrity and thorough research methods. He had manipulated Dr. Koss's genetic samples because she was respected throughout the scientific community. When these two individuals vouched for the authenticity of the evidence, others would believe it. The information began spreading beyond academic circles when a junior researcher at the university leaked copies of the historical documents to the Planetary Communication Network. Within hours, Millions of Catherians were reading about their supposed origins as refugees saved by the despised Orvani. The reaction was immediate and intense. Lower caste Catherians, who had always been told they were inferior to the upper castes, began questioning why they should accept such treatment if all Catherians were descended from refugees. If their ancestors had needed help from other species to survive, what made them naturally superior to anyone else? Religious leaders found themselves facing uncomfortable questions about Catherian creation myths. The official religious doctrine taught that Catherians had been chosen by divine forces to rule over lesser species. How could this be true if they were actually related to the pacifist Orvani, who were considered one of the weakest species in the galaxy? Upper caste Catherians reacted with outrage and denial. Many declared the documents to be obvious forgeries created by human intelligence agents. However, when pressed to explain how humans could have created documents using authentic ancient materials and perfect classical script, they had no answers. Government officials tried to suppress the information, but it had already spread too far. Independent research teams confirmed both the historical documents and the genetic evidence. Scientists from allied species examined the data and agreed that it appeared authentic. Even Catherian military intelligence could find no evidence that the discoveries were fabricated. The Empire's response became increasingly desperate. Admiral Roth, already under pressure for his destruction of the hospital ship, declared that the genetic evidence proved Catherians had successfully purged themselves of Orvani weakness through superior breeding practices. His argument satisfied no one and only drew more attention to the controversial findings. Middle caste Catherians found themselves caught between competing interpretations of the evidence. Some embraced their supposed Orvani heritage, arguing that it proved Catherians could learn from other species and didn't need to dominate them. Others rejected the evidence entirely, claiming it was part of a conspiracy to weaken the Empire. The debate raged for weeks across Catherian society. Scientific journals published detailed analysis of the genetic data. Historical societies organized conferences to discuss the implications of the documents. Religious councils met in emergency sessions to address challenges to their core doctrines. Alex monitored the growing chaos from his hidden station. His psychological analysis had been accurate. Catherian society was fracturing along the exact lines he had predicted. The rigid caste system that held their empire together was beginning to crack as people questioned the fundamental assumptions that justified their social order. But Alex was not finished. He had planted additional evidence throughout Catherian space, time to surface just as the initial discoveries reached maximum impact. Archaeological sites would reveal artifacts that supported the historical documents. Medical databases would be updated with genetic information that reinforced the Orvani connection. Academic libraries would discover additional historical records that provided even more embarrassing details about early Catherian history. The psychological virus Alex had created was designed to be self-reinforcing. Each new revelation would make Catherians more suspicious of their official history. Each piece of evidence would encourage them to question other aspects of their society. The Empire's own scientists and historians would become unwitting agents of its destruction, validating information that undermined everything they had believed about themselves. As reports of civil unrest began reaching Alex's monitoring stations, he allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. The beings who had murdered 3,000 innocent patients on the Hope's Light were about to learn that their supposed superiority was nothing more than a carefully constructed lie. And unlike the victims of the hospital ship, they would have plenty of time to understand exactly what was happening to them. The riots began on Catheria Prime during what should have been a routine ceremony honoring military achievements. General Stark was presenting awards to officers who had distinguished themselves in recent battles when a group of lower caste soldiers interrupted the proceedings. They demanded to know why they should risk their lives for an empire built on lies about racial superiority. "If we're all descended from Orvani refugees," shouted Sergeant Polk, a decorated veteran of 12 campaigns, then what makes the upper castes better than us? Why do they get the best positions while we die in their wars? General Stark tried to maintain order, but more soldiers joined the protest. Within hours, similar demonstrations erupted across the planet. Lower caste Catherians who had spent their lives accepting their inferior status suddenly refused to acknowledge the authority of their supposed betters. The protests spread to other worlds throughout the Empire. On the industrial planet of New Catheria, factory workers abandoned their posts and demanded equal treatment with management. On the military base at Fortress 7, enlisted soldiers refused orders from upper caste officers. Supply lines that had functioned smoothly for centuries ground to a halt as lower caste personnel questioned why they should serve those who were no better than themselves. Religious institutions faced their own crisis. The Temple of Eternal Dominance, which taught that Catherians were divinely chosen to rule other species, found its congregations demanding explanations for the genetic evidence of Orvani ancestry. High Priest Malcolm attempted to reinterpret traditional doctrines to accommodate the new information, but his efforts satisfied neither traditionalists nor reformers. A radical religious movement emerged called the Children of Truth, led by a middle caste priest named Brother David. This group embraced the Orvani connection and argued that Catherians had fallen from grace by abandoning their ancestors' peaceful nature. They preached that the Empire's aggressive expansion and subjugation of other species had brought divine punishment in the form of this shameful revelation. The Children of Truth gained followers rapidly, particularly among younger Catherians who had grown tired of constant warfare. Their meetings drew thousands of participants who performed traditional Orvani meditation practices and called for an end to the Empire's military campaigns. Upper caste Catherians responded with increasing desperation. Emperor Vaughn declared a state of emergency and authorized the use of military force against protesters. However, when troops were ordered to fire on demonstrators, many refused. The genetic evidence had convinced even military personnel that their society's hierarchical structure was unjust. Admiral Roth found himself at the center of the growing chaos. His destruction of the human hospital ship had initially been praised by traditionalist factions as a demonstration of Catherian strength. Now, those same groups blamed him for triggering the crisis that had led to these devastating revelations about their origins. The Admiral attempted to rally support by claiming that the genetic evidence actually proved Catherian superiority. We took the weak, pacifist nature of the Orvani and transformed it into strength through centuries of selective breeding and cultural evolution, he declared during a broadcast to the entire Empire. His speech backfired spectacularly. Lower caste Catherians pointed out that if centuries of breeding had created their supposed superiority, then the process should have affected all Catherians equally. Why should upper caste individuals be considered naturally better if their advantages came from cultural practices rather than genetic inheritance? The Empire's allied species watched these developments with growing alarm. The Draknari, who had joined the Empire voluntarily in exchange for protection and trade benefits, began reconsidering their allegiance. If Catherian superiority was a myth, then their alliance was based on false premises. The Centauran Federation, a group of species that had been conquered by the Empire decades earlier, saw an opportunity for rebellion. Their leaders secretly contacted each other and began coordinating resistance activities. If the Catherians were too busy fighting among themselves to maintain control, this might be the chance they had been waiting for. More damaging to imperial unity was the reaction of middle-caste Catherians who held key positions in government, military, and business. These individuals found themselves torn between loyalty to the Empire and growing doubts about its legitimacy. Some attempted to maintain the status quo, while others embraced the implications of the genetic evidence and called for major reforms. The Catherian military began fragmenting into competing factions. Admiral Smith, who commanded the Third Fleet, declared that the genetic evidence was irrelevant because Catherian military success proved their superiority regardless of their origins. Admiral Johnson, leader of the Seventh Fleet, argued that acknowledging their Orvani heritage would make the Empire stronger by encouraging cooperation with other species. These philosophical differences quickly escalated into open conflict. When Admiral Smith ordered his ships to attack civilian protesters on the planet Kyrios, Admiral Johnson intervened with her fleet to protect them. The resulting battle marked the first time in centuries that Catherian ships had fired on each other in anger. Similar conflicts erupted throughout Imperial space. Regional commanders chose sides based on their interpretation of the genetic evidence and its implications for Imperial policy. Some remained loyal to Emperor Vaughn and the traditional hierarchy. Others declared independence and established their own governments based on more egalitarian principles. The economic impact of the chaos was devastating. Trade routes became unreliable as different factions imposed conflicting regulations. Manufacturing centers shut down when workers and management could not agree on proper authority structures. The Empire's currency lost value as financial markets struggled to cope with political uncertainty. Alex monitored these developments from his hidden station with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. His psychological warfare campaign was working exactly as planned, but the speed and intensity of the collapse surprised even him. He had expected the process to take years, not months. The final blow to Imperial unity came when genetic researchers discovered additional evidence that seemed to confirm the most embarrassing aspects of Catherian-Orvani relations. New findings suggested that the early Catherians had not simply been helped by the Orvani, but had actually been a slave caste within Orvani society before their rebellion and exodus. This revelation shattered the remaining credibility of upper caste claims to natural leadership. If their ancestors had been slaves, then the entire foundation of imperial hierarchy was not just false, but was built on the exact opposite of historical reality. The former slaves had become the masters through deception and violence, not superior, breeding, or divine favor. Emperor Vaughn made a final, desperate attempt to hold the empire together by announcing that the genetic evidence was fabricated by human intelligence agents. He offered substantial rewards for anyone who could prove the information was false. However, independent verification by multiple research institutions had made such claims impossible to sustain. 3 months after the first documents appeared, the Catherian Empire effectively ceased to exist as a unified political entity. Dozens of separate governments claimed authority over different regions of former imperial space. The mighty fleet that had once threatened human civilization was scattered across the galaxy, with various factions fighting each other instead of external enemies. Admiral Roth, the architect of the hospital ship massacre, became a hunted man. Both traditionalists and reformers blamed him for the crisis that had destroyed their civilization. He was assassinated by his own bodyguards while attempting to escape to neutral space, ending his life as reviled by his own people as he was by humanity. 6 months had passed since the destruction of the Hope's Light, and the galaxy barely recognized the territory that had once been the mighty Catherian Empire. What had been a unified domain controlling 200 star systems was now a patchwork of 47 different governments, most of them hostile to each other. The former imperial capital of Catheria Prime was under siege by 3 separate factions claiming legitimate authority. The planet's cities burned as different military. Groups fought for control of government buildings. Millions of refugees fled to neighboring systems, creating humanitarian crises throughout the region. Intelligence agencies across the galaxy worked frantically to understand what had happened. The speed and completeness of the imperial collapse defied every known model of political transformation. Empires typically fell gradually over decades or centuries, weakened by economic problems, military defeats, or external pressure. The Catherian Empire had disintegrated in months without losing a single major battle to foreign enemies. Director Walsh of Human Intelligence sat in her office reviewing reports from field agents throughout former Catherian space. Her analysts had identified several contributing factors to the collapse: the genetic evidence linking Catherians to the Orvani, the historical documents revealing embarrassing truths about imperial origins, and the cascading social unrest that followed these revelations. What puzzled Director Walsh was the perfection of the information warfare campaign. Every piece of evidence had appeared at exactly the right moment to maximize psychological impact. The genetic data had been released just as the historical documents gained credibility. Additional archaeological discoveries had surfaced precisely when they would cause the most damage to imperial unity. "This wasn't random," she told her deputy, Agent Morris. "Someone orchestrated this entire sequence of events. Someone who understood Catherian psychology better than they understood themselves." Agent Morris nodded grimly. "Our behavioral analysis unit thinks we're looking for a single individual. The campaign shows too much internal consistency to be the work of a committee or organization. Whoever did this spent years studying Catherian society and planned every detail in advance." Director Walsh studied the timeline of events. The first documents appeared 3 weeks after the hospital ship massacre. That's barely enough time to create such sophisticated forgeries unless they were prepared in advance. "You think someone knew Admiral Roth would attack the Hope's Light?" "Not specifically, but someone anticipated that the Catherians would eventually commit an atrocity that would justify this kind of response." The mystery deepened when linguistic experts confirmed that the historical documents were written in perfect classical Catherian script, including obscure grammatical forms that few living beings understood. The genetic data had been manipulated, using techniques that required advanced knowledge of both Catherian and Orvani biology. The psychological targeting showed intimate familiarity with imperial social structures and cultural values. Director Walsh ordered a comprehensive review of all humans who possessed the necessary expertise for such an operation. The list was surprisingly short. Most xenobiologists and alien psychology experts worked for government agencies and could be accounted for. The few independent researchers lacked access to the resources needed for such an elaborate campaign. One name on the list immediately caught her attention: Dr. Alex Chen, formerly humanity's leading expert on alien psychology, who had disappeared 5 years earlier after a dispute with military leadership. His personnel file showed exactly the kind of background that would be needed for this operation. "Find him," Director Walsh ordered. The search for Alex took weeks. His hidden research station in the asteroid belt was shielded from most detection methods and powered by carefully concealed fusion reactors. Only when human intelligence satellites detected unusual communication patterns did they locate his base of operations. When human agents finally reached the asteroid station, they found Alex waiting for them calmly in his laboratory. He had monitored their approach and made no attempt to flee or resist. Instead, he offered them coffee and invited them to sit down for what he called a long overdue conversation. "You destroyed an entire empire," Agent Morris accused. Alex shrugged. "I revealed the truth about their origins. They destroyed themselves by refusing to accept what they learned. Those documents were forgeries. The documents were reconstructions, based on authentic historical evidence that the Catherians had destroyed centuries ago. Every fact I included was true, even if the specific papers were newly created." Agent Morris struggled to understand the distinction. "So you fabricated evidence to support true claims?" "I returned stolen history to its rightful owners." The Catherians had systematically erased records of their actual origins and replaced them with myths of racial superiority. I simply undid their historical revisionism. Director Walsh leaned forward with interest. "What about the genetic evidence?" "Completely accurate. Catherians and Orvanis are closely related species, exactly as my data indicated. The imperial government had suppressed this information for political reasons. I made sure their own scientists could no longer ignore the truth. The implications were staggering. Alex had not lied or fabricated false information. Instead, he had forced an entire civilization to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves that their leaders had hidden for centuries. The empire had collapsed, not because of deception, but because its social order could not survive contact with reality. "Why?" Director Walsh asked. "Why did you do this?" Alex's expression hardened. 3,000 innocent beings died on that hospital ship. Among them was Dr. Emma Ward, who saved my life during the Battle of Centauri Prime. Admiral Roth murdered her and all the others to make a point about Catherian superiority. I decided to show him exactly how superior his people really were. This was revenge. This was justice. The Catherians built their empire on lies about their own nature. They conquered and enslaved other species because they believed themselves naturally superior. When that belief was proven false, their entire civilization collapsed. That's not my fault. That's the inevitable result of building a society on foundations of deception. Agent Morris shook his head in amazement. You single-handedly ended a galactic war. I ended an empire that deserved to end. The war was just a symptom of a deeper problem, the Catherian belief that they had the right to dominate other species. Once that belief was shattered, the empire became unsustainable. Director Walsh realized she was in the presence of someone who had fundamentally changed the balance of power in the galaxy. What happens now? Alex stood and walked to his observation window, looking out at the stars. Now, the galaxy learns a new lesson about the nature of power. Military strength and advanced technology mean nothing if your society is built on lies. The most dangerous weapon in the universe is not a fleet of warships or a planet-killing bomb. It's the truth. Properly applied. Will you come back to work for human intelligence? Director Walsh asked. Alex turned from the window with a slight smile. I never stopped working for humanity. I just chose my own methods and timeline. Within hours of the meeting, Alex released a comprehensive report detailing his entire operation. The document explained his psychological analysis of Catherian society, his methods for creating and distributing the historical evidence, and his predictions for how the empire would fragment. He transmitted the report simultaneously to every major news organization, government, and academic institution in the galaxy. The reaction was immediate and profound. Alien civilizations across the galaxy began emergency reviews of their own historical records and social structures. Leaders who had previously dismissed human intelligence capabilities now viewed humanity with a mixture of respect and fear. The Andorian Republic immediately commissioned a study to identify potential weaknesses in their own governmental system. The Centauran Alliance hired human consultants to analyze their society for vulnerabilities similar to those that had destroyed the Catherians. Even the powerful Vegan Confederacy quietly reached out to human diplomats seeking assurances that their empire would not be targeted for similar treatment. Alex's report included detailed psychological profiles of dozens of alien species, demonstrating depth of knowledge that shocked xenobiologists throughout the galaxy. He had not simply studied the Catherians in isolation, but had developed comprehensive theories about how different types of alien societies could be influenced or destabilized through information warfare. The document's most disturbing section outlined 12 other galactic civilizations that Alex identified as potentially vulnerable to similar psychological attacks. Each analysis included specific recommendations for how their belief systems could be undermined and their social structures collapsed. The report read like a manual for destroying any empire in the galaxy without firing a single shot. Religious leaders across multiple species declared emergency councils to address the theological implications of Alex's work. If human intelligence could identify and exploit the fundamental lies underlying alien civilizations, What did that say about the nature of truth and faith? Several major religious movements declared Alex either a prophet revealing divine truth or a demon spreading chaos and destruction. The economic impact was equally significant. Stock markets crashed as investors realized that any government or corporation could be destroyed overnight if their foundational assumptions were proven false. Insurance companies began offering new policies protecting against information warfare, casualties. Some corporations hired human psychologists to audit their organizational cultures for potential vulnerabilities. Military academies throughout the galaxy added new courses on defensive psychology and information security. The traditional focus on weapons technology and tactical training was supplemented with education about protecting social cohesion and maintaining morale in the face of psychological attacks. Alex became the most famous and feared human in galactic history. Some species declared him a war criminal for destroying an entire civilization. Others hailed him as a liberator who had freed billions of beings from Cytherian oppression. A few governments issued assassination contracts, while others offered him massive rewards to work exclusively for them. The man himself remained in his asteroid station, continuing his research with the same calm focus he had always displayed. He declined all interviews, job offers, and threats with equal indifference. His only public statement was a brief message, warning other species not to underestimate human capabilities. "Humanity may not have the largest fleets or the most advanced weapons," Alex's message read. "But we understand you better than you understand yourselves. We know your fears, your weaknesses, and the lies you tell yourselves to sleep at night. Remember that the next time you consider attacking human civilians." The former Cytherian territories remained in chaos for years. Some regions eventually stabilized under new governments that acknowledged their people's true historical origins. Others descended into permanent warfare between competing factions. The Orvani, ironically, found themselves courted by dozens of former Cytherian colonies seeking to reconnect with their peaceful heritage. Dr. Emma Ward and the other victims of the Hope's Light were posthumously honored by every major galactic organization. Memorial services were held on 100 worlds, and the date of the hospital ship's destruction became an official day of remembrance for medical neutrality. The Red Cross symbol became a universal sign of protection that even the most aggressive species refused to violate. Admiral Roth's name became synonymous with the destruction of the empire he had tried to serve. Historical analysis showed that his attack on the hospital ship had provided Alex with the moral justification needed to launch his psychological warfare campaign. In attempting to demonstrate Cytherian strength, Roth had instead triggered the revelation of Cytherian weakness. The galaxy would never be the same. Every civilization now understood that military power was not enough to guarantee survival. Social cohesion, historical honesty, and psychological resilience had become as important as weapons technology and economic strength. The age of simple conquest was over, replaced by a more complex era where the battle for truth could determine the fate of entire species. From his hidden station, Alex continued to monitor galactic communications and gather intelligence on alien societies. He had proven that one human with sufficient knowledge and determination could reshape the balance of power across the galaxy. The question that kept alien leaders awake at night was simple. What would he choose to do next? The answer, for now, was nothing. Alex had achieved his goal of avenging the Hope's Light and demonstrating the dangers of underestimating humanity. He was content to let other species contemplate the implications of his work, while he pursued new research into the psychological foundations of galactic civilization. But everyone knew that if another species made the mistake of attacking innocent humans, Alex Chen would be watching, and the consequences would be swift, inevitable, and devastating.